Anthony Zepeda, and I will be your moderator for today's office hours. We're going to hold just a minute or two for more of our colleagues to join us for today's session. In the meantime, I want you all to introduce yourselves in the chat with your name and the region you represent, and we will begin in about 1 minute. Okay, I think we are ready to get started. Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG. My name is Anthony Zepeda, and I am today's moderator. If you are just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. And as a reminder, this office hour session is being recorded for public record. Next slide, please. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the question box. Please type your organization and question into the question box, and our team will read the questions out loud at the end of the presentation, and we will provide answers throughout the presentation in the Q&A box or out loud at the end of the session as time permits. Alongside our presenters, we have several HCD staff, representatives, and specialists who can help answer the questions during the Q&A session. If for some reason we cannot answer your question today, we will either get back to you or recommend that you complete a HUD AAQ and submit the question directly to HUD. So last reminder, please put your questions in the Q&A box. It's a little box down at the bottom thread, the bottom ribbon of Zoom. And don't put them in the chat as they quickly get lost there. I know it's tempting to put them in there and get a quick response, but in general, we miss them because they're in the chat. We focus directly on the Q&A box. Next slide, please. Please note that both the slides and the recording will be sent to all participants within approximately 2 weeks of today's session. And next slide. Okay, this is our agenda for today, but before we get started on the agenda, we wanted to provide you a quick update on the elephant in the room. As many of you are aware, an executive order was signed by the president that put a temporary freeze on all federal grants, loans, and obligations. In response to this executive order signed by President Trump on Monday evening, the Federal Office of Management and Budget has issued a temporary pause on all activities related to the obligation or disbursement of all federal funds, grants, loans, and financial assistance. We are currently reviewing the memo and are working with our federal counterparts to receive clarity. And this is a fluid situation. We're hearing reports that there's a freeze on the freeze, but we are confident that in our ability to continue serving Californians, and more information will be forthcoming at a later date. Having said that, if you have any RFFs ready to submit, including changes we have sent back for corrections on a previously submitted RFF, please get to work on those as soon as you can and submit them. We will review and process as quickly as we can. Okay, back to our agenda. Today's office hour session includes the following: welcome and introductions, some updates on 2023 contracts, followed by today's spotlight session, everyone's favorite, indirect costs, followed by a Q&A session. Next slide, please. This is our ESG team. We're the team that works directly with grantees to administer the ESG program. Please reach out to one of us reps listed on the slide, Sam, Giovanni, or myself, and we will get back to you. You can also reach out to the NOFA If it's a more general question, the NOFA inbox is monitored Monday through Friday during normal business hours, so your email will reach one of us. Next slide, please. This slide shows a schedule of upcoming office hours. We're still in the process of finding the topics for the next 2 office hours, but we anticipate they'll be directly related to the 2024 NOFA and application. But what I do want to highlight is the next office hours in 2 weeks, 12th. We're going to have a live demonstration of the 2024 ESG application. And so bring your questions and we'll go over everything that has to do with the NOFA. Go ahead. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, everyone. I'm losing my screen here. Here we go. And this is an update of our NOFA schedule. The application portal is going to open in just a couple of days, this Friday. And the applications will be due in eCivis by 5 p.m. time on March 28, 2025. And then we anticipate award announcements in July 2025. Next slide, please. Okay, we wanted to go over a few of the performance milestone reminders for your 2023 contract. The expenditure deadline for the 2023 contract is August 17th, 2025, which is about 7 short months away. This is the cutoff incurred 23 contracts. Related to that, 80% of your contract must be expended by June 17th of this year. And then grantees, as we touched on earlier, you're required to submit an RFF at least per quarter, but we highly recommend that you submit them monthly. We'll continue to provide reminders on the grant expenditure deadlines on a regular basis, but please reach out to us if you need assistance or having an issue with getting your money deployed in your communities. Next slide, please.
Anthony, just
yes.
a heads up, that 80% contract deadline should be July 17th, I believe, instead of
okay.
June.
Thank you. That's probably a typo on my part.
Yeah. So just a reminder, everybody, that should be July 17th, not June. So thank you, Anthony.
Oh, no worries. Thank you. And related to that, your request for funding requirements for the 2023 grants. This may be new news for many of you, but we did send out emails about a month ago with a welcome letter attached. And in those welcome letters, we highlighted the new RFF submission requirements. So these next 2 slides highlight these requirements. And for this first slide, we're going to look at what is required with your first RFF, your request for funding. All of the line items identified in the DIR in your first RFF require full backup documentation. So if the line item is for staff expenses, you'll need to include time cards, payroll documents. If you're submitting an RFF for rapid rehousing, full client files are required. If you're unsure what that means, we can provide you with a client file checklist for rapid rehousing and other ESG components. And all supporting documentation must be uploaded to eCivis. We cannot accept submissions by email. And please make sure to redact any personally identifying information, or PII, prior to submitting. And I just want to reiterate, if you are awarded rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention funds, you must have approved policies and procedures in place prior to submitting your first RFF. And I guess just to summarize, your first RFF is the equivalent to a full monitoring. We're going to look at it line by line. We're going to make sure all of your documentation is correct. And the intent is not to make this onerous on you. Actually, it's a longer game approach where we're trying to limit, we're trying to catch things early, and therefore limit the amount of annual monitoring that we have to do each year on our grantees by catching these problems early and assessing risk assessments of our grantees early, so that we don't have to do so much monitoring annually at the end of the year. It's a process that might be tough at first, but we're very confident that once we get rolling, we're going to be fine. And it'll be a very smooth, seamless process. Next slide, please. So on the previous slide, we just went over the requirements for the first RFF. And now here are the requirements for submitting RFF number 2 and subsequent RFFs. Grantees are required to submit supporting documentations for 2 line items per component. And grantees are the ones who get to choose which 2 line items. So you pick 2 line items from your RFF, submit those, and submit the backup documentations, and we will review those. Once again, if it's rapid rehousing or homelessness prevention, you must include full client files. When monitoring, that's a requirement by HUD. So when we do monitor our subgrantees, we are required to look at your full client files. And of course, once again, please ensure that you have redacted all PII from any files you submit in eCivis. One caveat to this. While the grantee is the one who chooses the 2 line items for which you will be submitting supporting documentation, HCD does have the right to request additional supporting documentation on other line items as applicable. I just want to throw that in there. Next slide, please. So let's pause here and address any questions you may have regarding our update slides. Amanda, do we have anything at this point?
No. Oh, for client files, should the submission contain the items listed on the ESG client file checklist? The answer to that would be yes. That would be perfect.
And I'll drop one of those in the chat later on in the, if someone doesn't, one of the other team members don't drop it in the chat, I'll drop that in the chat later for a client file checklist. They're on the webpage too, the ESG webpage.
I also wanted to add that the 80% expenditure milestone deadline actually is June 17th. So the PowerPoint is correct. It's 60 days before expenditure. So we're good.
Okay, so we've clarified that, everyone. When you're going back and reviewing these slides, because we know that all of our grantees go back and review these, they're so fascinating. However, if you do go back and review the 80% deadline listed on the slide is actually correct. So please make note of that. And so if we could go to the next slide. Okay, ESG Office Hours Spotlight, indirect cost, everyone's favorite subject. And so as we kick off the new year here in ESG land, our office hours spotlights have, of course, been focused on the 2024 ESG NOFA and the application. And more specifically, we have been trying to focus our attention on the sections of the NOFA and the application that have traditionally presented a lot of challenges to our grantees. For example, last time we covered the topic of authorizing resolutions. And today, another area that we receive a lot of questions and provide a lot of guidance on is the topic indirect costs. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are familiar with indirect costs, especially if you're in the finance or accounting team, this will be fairly simple and straightforward. However, we're guessing that for many of you, this may be your first time hearing about this topic, and that audience is who this presentation is aimed at. So we will be presenting a general high-level overview of indirect cost. We'll explain what they are. We'll provide a few examples on the different methods for calculating and allocating indirect costs within your ESG project budgets and when you're submitting RFS. The slide in front of you, as you can see on the top left, just a little disclaimer, ICF is a consultant we use for 2 years in ESG to present office hours. They presented a lot of great information, in particular on indirect costs. So we are using some of their slides here, and so that's why the ICF is up in the corner. And this slide in particular shows the agenda for today. We will cover 4 key areas at a very broad level. We're going to go over cost principles, classifying costs, that is identifying direct costs versus indirect costs, allocating indirect costs, and then charging indirect costs, how to budget and charge for your indirect costs within your ESG budgets. This can be a tough subject to grasp your first time through, and we know that. However, we're providing you with the resources and links with additional information on an indirect cost at the end of the presentation. And you can always reach out to your ESG representative or the NOFA inbox if you have questions on this. This is a component within the ESG application. And when you get there, you can always go back to these slides or you can reach out to your rep. Next slide, please. So for the cost principles, this is the framework that we're going to look at a high level. And these cost principles will guide you in how we at HCD treat all costs related to the ESG program. You can kind of visualize this framework as a funnel going from the most broad down to the most specific. So for number one, federal uniform guidance as it's defined in 2 CFR 200 is very general in terms of establishing costs and what they are and how you, I can't think of the best word, but how you approach your costs within a federal contract. Number two, HUD ESG program regulations that are specific to the ESG program are a bit more restrictive as we move down the funnel. And then the most specific part of the framework as we move to the bottom is your standard agreement with HCD. So we're going to go over these three briefly in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So the cost principles as established in federal guidance for Office of Management and Budget in 2 CFR Part 200, it has 4 main criteria for your cost. And these are what we look at as a team when we're monitoring and evaluating budgets for our ESG programs. The cost must first be necessary. Well, I'll do a broadly: necessary, reasonable, allowable, and allocable. Is it necessary? For example, ESG cost. Is it necessary to implement the ESG program goal? Is it a reasonable expense? Is the expense in your ESG budget allowable? For example, is it within the program component guidelines? Entertainment, alcoholic beverages, real drastic examples of what are not allowable. And is it allocable? Can you directly or indirectly allocate the costs to an ESG component? Next slide, please. So moving one layer deeper in the funnel, we start to narrow the types of costs allowed in ESG. And we outline those type of costs here. Is it included within eligible activities in the ESG regulations? Was it incurred for the benefit of an eligible ESG beneficiary? Was it adequately documented? And that's what we're touching on with the RFS when we look for backup documentation. Is it consistent with your agency's policies and procedures? We're going to look at those as well when you submit an RFF. Do you have approved policies and procedures? And is it treated consistently as either a direct or an indirect throughout your budget and in your RFS? Next slide, please. The final piece of the framework is the standard agreement with HCD. All reimbursed costs must be included within the approved activity component budget, and they must be incurred during the improved grant budget time period. We touched on that in the updates for the 2023, the expenditure deadline. So they must be incurred during the approved grant budget time period. Next slide, please. So those are that's the cost. That's kind of the theory of cost. That's how we look at costs. That's how we evaluate costs. Whenever you submit an RFF for your budget, we are following those guidelines and will require documentation supporting your budgets and your RFFs. Next, we go to classifying cost or identifying types of costs, direct versus indirect. As you can see on the slide, direct costs that can be specifically assigned to a particular award or activity relatively easily and with a high degree of certainty. Indirect costs are costs incurred for shared or joint objectives that cannot be readily assigned or to a particular award or activity. We're going to go into a few examples of this, so we understand that this may be new to many of you in this terminology, but we'll touch on this on the next slide. Go ahead, Gio. So here are some examples of direct costs. Now, this isn't all inclusive. There are many, many types of direct costs within ESG, but these are just a few of the most common that you'll see in an ESG program. For direct personnel costs, they're going to be staff costs incurred to provide, I'm reading verbatim, but you can see they're very specific to the ESG program, and they are very specific to beneficiaries that are enrolled in an ESG program. Direct personnel costs could include signed timesheets, payroll records, and proof of payment. Direct non-personnel costs could be vehicles purchased by the street outreach team. And you can see this examples of this include procurement records, invoices, and proof of payment. And then you have direct participant support costs, rental assistance payments. And as many of you are familiar, we will request your copy of your lease and rental agreements and proof of payments. Next slide, please. And now here are some examples of indirect costs. While direct costs are usually easy to show, a direct expense like a rental assistance to a specific ESG recipient, indirect costs are harder to identify as a specific allocable expense to the ESG program. For examples, general legal, payroll, and human resources expenses related to the ESG program. You also have indirect facilities costs, indirect administrative costs. Next slide, please. So this slide provides an example of direct costs versus indirect costs. The very basic example in under direct costs, a staff member A is fully dedicated to ESG. That's a very specific and easy to identify direct costs. Example B, in the orange, staff member B works on ESG, but also works on other federal grant and documents their hours spent per grant on their timesheets. Once again, pretty straightforward in terms of allocating it as a direct cost within the ESG program. Indirect costs can be, as mentioned, a little different. For instance, the payroll and human resources departments, they process the payroll for staff member A and staff member B, and for all of the grantees or the subrecipients. That would be an example of an indirect cost. Next slide, please. So we're moving along pretty quickly. We covered cost principles, which is the guiding framework, and then classifying or identifying costs, direct versus indirect. And once again, we're covering these at a very high level. And now we're going to go over about allocating indirect costs. There are three methods. There is the most common that we do here at HCD and usually with federal grants is the de minimis indirect cost rate. Number two is the negotiated indirect cost rate. And three is a cost allocation plan. We're going to go over all three of these briefly in the upcoming slides. Next slide, please. As mentioned, the de minimis method is the most common way of allocating indirect cost in the California ESG program. And as part of your 2024 NOFA application, there will be an indirect cost certification section where agencies can state their intention to claim or to not claim indirect costs within their program budget. And as you can see on the slide, the agencies may elect to charge a de minimis rate of 15% of their modified total direct costs, which may be used indefinitely. And we're going to go over that a little bit more in an upcoming slide. And there are a few caveats, federal requirements for the de minimis method that are listed on this slide. And we're going to cover those in just a second, but I will touch on them now. Agencies receiving over $35 million in direct federal funding may not use the 15% de minimis rate. Or if your agency already has a negotiated indirect cost rate on file, they may not use the de minimis rate. No documentation is required to justify the 15% de minimis rate to HCD, but you do have to do so in-house with your accounting team, and we will touch on that more on the next slide. Go ahead. So going back to the definitions, the negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, or NICRA, if your agency receives $34 million or more in direct federal funding, 200 CFR Part 2 requires that you must submit a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement to your federal cognizant agency. Next slide, please. Finally, we get to the cost allocation plan. This is for agencies or organizations that receive $100 million or more in direct federal funding, they must submit a cost allocation plan. Now, this is a formal accounting exercise, so we are really not going to touch too much on this today or go into specifics. However, we will have resources at the end of this presentation. You can click on the resources tab it will provide, and you can dig deep into this, but we always recommend that you work with your accounting team or with a local CPA if you have questions on the cost allocation plan. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're moving forward to charging for indirect costs. This, once again, very general. You don't have to memorize this verbatim, but just to have a general idea for charging for indirect costs. The indirect costs, to calculate the amount of indirect costs chargeable to your ESG awards, grantees must multiply the allowable direct cost base by their agency's indirect cost rate. The direct cost included in the base and the percentage used will depend on the specific method utilized by your particular agency. Next slide, please. So let's give a few examples. Charging for indirect cost using the de minimis method, which is the most common method used by our grantees. The predetermined indirect cost rate, as established by federal regulations, is now 15%. That was updated, increased from 10% in October of 2024. So the 15% rate is new for the 2024 contracts. If you have a 2023 contracts and you're using the de minimis rate, it is still 10%. It applies to the 2023 contract. And we'll have the 10% on a few examples just for simplicity's sake in a few slides. But for now, it is 15%. And this rate is applied directly to your cost base, which is known as the modified total direct costs, or MTDC. These MTDCs are a predetermined cost base, which is defined in uniform guidance and illustrated on this slide. It can include direct salaries, wages, fringe benefits, supplies, materials, services, travels, and up to 50,000 of each subaward. Next slide, please. So how does that look in terms of budgeting? We provided a couple slides here. They're a little busy, but they are helpful if you can take some time to look at them when you're putting together your budget. It's going to be 3 phases, and it works from top to bottom, the 3 separate boxes there. And we provide an example of how to establish your base cost rate. And at the bottom, we come up with your total cost, and then the cost that will be included in your MTDC. And that then leads down to phase 2. You'll first establish your cost rate, your base cost rates. Then you will calculate your indirect cost rate based on your base amount. And for this example, we have it at 10%. So 670,000 times 10% gives you a total indirect cost amount of 67,000. And we go down to phase 3, where you apply your indirect cost amount. You add it to your total direct cost to determine your ESG project budget. So this slide shows, 1, how we establish the indirect cost rate and the indirect cost amount, added it to our total costs for the program, and then which established our total budget for our ESG grant. Next slide, please. So then how does that look on your first RFF? Well, we provided the example again. It's a very similar example. We try to make sure it's in a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, so you can follow the progression. And so you'll establish your direct cost amounts in your RFF. You'll multiply your indirect cost rate by your direct cost, and then you'll add your total direct cost and total indirect cost for your total RFF amount, which is listed at the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please. Okay, you guys, I know we're moving fast here, but like I said, we're trying to keep it general, and we're going to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So now we're moving into charging for indirect cost if you're using the NICRA method or the CAP method. Once again, this is very rare in terms of our ESG grant recipients, but we do have 1 or 2 who can use these methods and probably do within their accounting teams. So the agencies using the NICRA or cost allocation plan will use a different process. First, if you look on the left, negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, a NICRA, is established in negotiation with the federal cognizant agency. On the left is an example of a NICRA with approved indirect cost rates at the bottom. And on the right is an example of a certification of that NICRA by the federal cognizant agency. And the cognizant agency for indirect cost, it just means it's the federal agency responsible for reviewing, negotiating, and approving cost allocation plans for your indirect cost. And it is usually going to be, if you don't know who that is going to be, it is usually going to be who you receive the most direct federal funds. And for governmental units, it's going to be HUD more than likely. And for nonprofits, look at your most recent audit or check with your accounting team. It's the agency that you receive the largest percentage of your federal funding from. They will help you determine your NICRA or your CPA. Next slide, please. And so we have two quick slides that were very similar to the de minimis slides. First, we're going to show you how to budget for your indirect costs using these two methods, NICRA and CAP. And then we're going to show you specifically an example of how you would charge for your indirect costs using the NICRA and CAP methods. So once again, a three-phase top to bottom approach to make it simple. You establish your base cost rates for your agency. In the second box, you will calculate your indirect cost rate. Here, it's a negotiated amount of 17.5%, which will give you your total indirect cost amount. And then we move down to the next box, and you take your total direct amount, and you add your total indirect cost amount for a total overall grant amount. Next slide, please. And so how does that look when you're doing an RFF? Very similar, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. First, you will establish your direct cost amounts. And then you go down to the second box, multiply your indirect cost rate by your direct cost base to come to a total indirect cost amount of $25,156.25. And then we go down to the next box, and you're submitting your first RFF using this method. You have a total direct amount of $233,250. Your indirect cost is the next box over, $25,156.25. Add those together for your total RFF amount. Next slide, please. So if I haven't put you to sleep yet, there are a few things to keep in mind in terms of indirect costs. Not every grantee claims indirect costs. If you're able to allocate and charge 100% of your ESG costs directly, fantastic, do so. It is not mandatory to claim indirect cost. You do not have to claim indirect cost. And number 3, California HCD cannot require you to use one method over another or prohibit the reimbursement of indirect costs. However, there are federal requirements that determine the method your agency would use. Those are touched on in the slides that we went over. If you recall, 35 million, you have to use one method. Over 100 million, you have to use another method. The last thing that we want to remind you on is that agencies must state and certify their intention to claim indirect costs at the time of your grant application. There will be a section within the 2024 NOFA application where you will fill out a form stating whether you will or will not claim indirect costs. Now, I will turn it over to Tuesday Cool, who will provide a few more examples of claiming indirect costs. Tuesday, take it away.
All right, thank you, Anthony. As Anthony stated, HCD is not advising your organization on if or how to take indirect costs. You need to work with your organization and accounting team to make these decisions. Also, the 15% modified cost changes are in effect for your 2024 award and not for your 2023 award. If your organization does decide to utilize the de minimis for their 2024 ESG award, a template has been provided in the application process. As you saw in previous slides, not all direct costs are included in the MTDC. For indirect costs, ICF helped us develop a workbook that helps calculate your MTDC and allowable indirect costs. We've got an example here. This is the first tab of the workbook that you'll be utilizing in your application process. The first tab of the template will automatically calculate your estimated indirect costs based on your direct cost base. In this slide, the calculator determined that for an award of $281,250, there will be $18,750 of indirect costs and $262,500 of direct costs for that total amount. Next slide, please. This slide shows a rapid rehousing indirect costs. The second tab of the worksheet includes a section for each component. In this rapid rehousing example, the 500,000 housing search and placement and the 25,000 housing stability qualify for indirect costs, but application fees and security deposits do not. The worksheet will calculate this when you fill it in and populate that number onto the first tab. For this award, the grantee is eligible for $11,250 in indirect costs for their $206,250 in rapid housing award. Next slide. This slide is for administrative costs. It's an example of when a unit of government is taking administrative costs. Only units of government can claim administrative costs and only up to 1% of their ESG grant. Other organizations may be able to claim some general and admin costs as indirect costs. You need to work with your accounting team to determine if that's allowable. Please note that staffing is a direct cost that qualify for indirect costs on this tab, but office rent is not. If your organization will be using the 15% de minimis, please fill out the workbook that's included in the application and upload with your application. It is due at the same time. This workbook can also be used to calculate your indirect costs for each RFF, as Anthony discussed earlier. Enter your known charges from each RFF, and it'll help you calculate the amount that you can claim as indirect costs in each funding request. If your organization has a NICRA or a cost allocation plan, you need to upload those current documents from your cognizant entity and include the estimated indirect cost in your budget when you're doing your application. Next slide, and back to Anthony.
Can I just clarify one thing about that?
Please.
Tuesday? Yeah. So on that spreadsheet or that workbook, the grade cells, that means that those are not indirect cost allowable activities. So you will not be able to, like, there will be no indirect costs in those.
And the workbook will calculate that for you, and it will leave that those cells blank or with a zero total in them.
Yeah. So if you go back one more slide, all of those grade cells will be $0 because indirect costs are not allowable in those. So please do not try to mess with the calculations in those. ICF did those on purpose. So please do not mess with those. If you do, we will have to send it back to you brand new, all zeroed out, and you will have to recalculate it all again. So please do not mess with the workbook. Leave it as is, put in your budget, and it should work perfectly as it is. So, okay,
thank you, Amanda.
Yes. Yes.
And if you have questions when you're filling it out, please reach out to either the NOFA inbox or your rep. They can help you.
Yes.
Yes, and I just wanted to actually add one more thing. If you can go back to the very first slide of the workbook. So just the top part, the grantee name, indirect cost method, and the indirect cost rate you'll have to fill out. Everything else on that screen is a roll up and will auto populate from the other tabs, the other slides.
So leave that as is, like zeroed out, and it'll roll up to that.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the indirect cost rate, you change it to whatever your negotiated cost rate is, or if you're not using 15%, so you want 8%, you put 8% in there. Okay, take it over, Anthony.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very helpful. And so, going back to what I said at the start of the presentation, this is a challenging subject, So don't panic if you feel like you've missed something. I mean, in 2024 last year, we had 3 office hour sessions devoted to this. And each time I still learn something new. So just, take in what you can, study the slides, and then we've also listed some great resources here on the slide. In particular, we have links to the 2 CFR 200 cost principles, and the appendices help define indirect cost. Also, 24 CFR 576 are the specific ESG regulations, and you can also find out about allowable and how you method of distribution for your direct and indirect costs. HUD also has resources in their financial management virtual toolkit, and then they have a great indirect cost toolkit. Just a note on the indirect cost toolkit, they haven't updated the language yet, so they still refer to the 10% de minimis requirement, which was, as mentioned before, that was updated in October of 2024. It went from 10% to 15%. So next slide, please. And now I will go back to Amanda to see if we have any questions from the Q&A box.
Yes, we have 2. I actually answered one, but it was worded so well, I'm going to read the whole thing and answer it live. Regarding the FMR waiver, we would like to confirm that units that are leased under the waiver through the approved period will continue to be eligible after October or the release of the FMR updates in 2025, provided the lease was signed within the period covered by the waiver for the duration the client is assisted, or at least through the lease agreement. For example, if a unit was approved under the waiver and the lease was signed in September, the unit would not suddenly become ineligible and unfunded after October or the waiver or the FMR update. And that is true. So this is regarding the FMR waiver. Sorry, this is not about indirect costs. So this is regarding the email that went out last week about the FMR waiver. So we have currently we have an FMR waiver that is available through October or until the 2026 FMR numbers come out. And so, which is usually October. So if a client signs a lease in September before those numbers come out, they can continue with that lease and that amount through the entire lease. So up to 2 years, they do not have to change just because FMR changes. So yes, they are good. Your organization is good. If they sign before the FMR changes, everything's good. So then back to indirect costs. To clarify, individual project applicants are eligible to request 15% indirect cost rate, and COCs are eligible to request 1% admin cost to administer the grants. Okay.
I'll jump on the first part of the question, Amanda.
You can take it, Anthony. I'm still thinking about the FMR waivers. Go ahead.
So to clarify, this is a 2-part question, and I'm going to address the first part. Individual project applicants are eligible to request a 15% indirect cost rate. They're asking us to clarify that. Yes, that is correct. However, the caveat, HCD does not determine what you will select or the type. Federal requirements will dictate that, as touched on in the earlier slides. The most common is for agencies to take the de minimis, the 15%. However, if your agency receives more than 35 million in direct federal funds or 100 million in direct federal funds, you cannot take the de minimis, a 15% de minimis. You have to use the NICRA or the cost allocation plan. And if you're still unsure, work with your local accounting department, or if you're a very small agency, I'm guessing you're probably going to be 15%. But if you're a governmental agency, work with your finance team. They can let you know what they use, what they have, the percentage they already have agreed upon. The second part of the question is COCs are eligible to request 1% admin costs to administer the grants. Is that correct? And I'll give that one to Tuesday and Amanda as they speak to it much more eloquently.
So yes, the COC, if the COC is the applicant, then yes, they are allowed to take the 1% in admin. And then their service providers or the organizations that apply to them for the ESG funding, they would get the indirect costs as their admin, which would be the COC's direct costs, if that makes sense. Tuesday, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, that is correct. The provider's indirect costs are actually direct costs of the applicant.
Next question. Landlord incentives were allowable with ESG CV funds. Are landlord incentives still allowable with regular ESG funds? And if so, is there a cap? I do not believe landlord incentives are allowable at this point. That was a waiver for ESG CV.
Yeah.
I have not seen any waivers that were being suggested that would
Okay.
include landlord incentives at this time.
And it looks like we did have one question come in through the chat. I don't know if it's been addressed yet. And the question is, so the ESG grant and other cost rates are due at the time of the grant submission. Yes, when you submit your grant application, when you're filling out your grant application, there will be a certification form where your agency must state their intentions on whether they plan to use or claim indirect cost. That's all part of the application. It'll be there, and we will probably cover it next week, or not next week, but in 2 weeks when we have the eCivis live application demo for the 2024 NOFA.
So there would be the indirect costs form where you're saying you're claiming indirect costs, and then also in the budget, you would put in the budget that how much you're claiming in indirect costs, also per component.
Correct.
Just to clarify that.
Thank you, Amanda.
So please, we've had issues in the past. People don't fill out the indirect cost certification. They claim that they don't want indirect costs at the beginning of the grant. And then at the very end of the grant, they forget that they didn't want it at the beginning, and then they want to claim it at the end. So please, if you do want it or you think you may want it at some point in the grant, please consider it at the very beginning.
Right, and anytime you need to make a change in your indirect cost, that triggers a budget amendment and
Yes.
causes considerable time delays.
Yes, and if you have any questions on it, we were like I keep reiterating this point. Indirect costs are tough, and don't try to, I would recommend not trying to understand them all today, or get all your ducks in a row in your mind right now. Think about it, work with your accounting team, talk to your accounting team, or to a local CPA, and when you're determining or establishing your budgets. And you can always reach out to the NOFA inbox or to your rep, and we will do our best to answer your question. But I just want to put the caveat in that while we're very familiar with how indirect costs work within our ESG program and budgets, we are very unfamiliar with how they're going to work for your particular agency. And so the onus falls on the grantee to make sure that they have at least a very basic understanding of how the indirect costs are going to work when they submit their RFFs and their budget in their application. And with that, do we have any more questions, Amanda?
Yeah, two more. Just confirming that the indirect cost of a subrecipient is the direct cost of the grant for the grantee. For example, LOCTA is the grantee and our subrecipient is LASA. So LASA's indirect costs are direct for LOCTA, correct?
Yes, that is correct. And go ahead,
And
Tuesday.
This is actually, I'm sorry, that LA was one of the places that I was thinking about how complicated this is because of the way
Yes.
your working relationship is. And I was specifically thinking of that, but decided not to include anything because it wasn't specific to everybody's situation. You're going to need to discuss how you claim lossless indirect costs with your accounting department. You also need to make sure that you do not fall under that LA itself doesn't fall under one of the other allocation plans, because there is a chance that you might need to be doing the one of the other plans.
NICRA
So
or cost allocation. And it's
NICRA, a
probably
NICRA.
likely
Thank you.
they'll
I
have
couldn't come.
both. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's something that you need to work with your accounting department and make sure that your accounting is correct.
Yeah, and touching on that, LA is going to be the very most complex example of this, but you probably
is.
have de
Deidre
minimis,
just said
NICRA, and CAP.
Deidre just said we do have the cost allocation.
Okay,
plan.
great.
So, Deidre, we can work with you. We can
Yeah.
talk.
Yeah,
to
we'd
you
love
if you
to.
want.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So is it true that the COC cannot charge indirect costs, only 1% admin?
No.
No,
Mm.
that's not correct. And for in this particular question, it's a very general, broad question, whereas the application of these principles are very specific to your particular organization and how you are set up with your subrecipients. And so that might take a further discussion with your accounting team or your local CPA or your finance team. But you can claim indirect costs, but the type of indirect costs you claim will be specific to your particular agency.
Yes, and if you are a COC, you can have up to 1% of your total grant in admin costs, and you can have, as part of your total grant, indirect costs. And there's also indirect costs within your admin. It's super stacked and complicated. But remember that your indirect costs are always going to be part of your entire grant. So if you have $200,000 total for your entire grant, your indirect costs are part of that 200,000 and not in addition to.
Okay. If the grantee is not awarded with indirect costs, can the subgrantees who have the NICRA in place be allowed to bill for indirect costs?
Yes, but once again, this is a very specific accounting related, finance related question specific to your agency. Go ahead. Well,
Whoever the direct grantee is with us is the one.
Yes, and that's what I was getting at, is that
Okay.
your subs may have a NICRA or a CAP in place, and they may bill you for it. However, you cannot bill ESG for if you have not claimed an indirect cost, you cannot bill us for an indirect cost or reimbursable cost if it is not claimed in your budget. So with your relationship with your subs, you may pay them for indirect costs as per your agreement with them. But per your standard agreement with HCD, if you haven't claimed indirect costs, you can't be reimbursed for indirect cost. And as I mentioned, we can get really deep down in the weeds. We're trying to avoid that, but we'll do our best to answer your questions. And you can also reach out to us directly, and we can then answer a little more directly and specific to your situation.
Right. And if you do have a NICRA in place, you need to have that included in your application process and claim your NICRA when you're applying for your 2024 grant. So we should have documentation for that and an expectation that you're doing 17.5% on these costs that your cognizant agency has deemed to be part of your NICRA.
Yeah.
And so that those all need to be included with your application and in the application process. We can't go back later and make that happen.
So the COC is not eligible for the 1% admin unless they apply directly. That is correct. Only the direct applicant is eligible for the 1% admin. The direct applicant can get the admin. Subrecipients of the direct applicant are not eligible for the admin.
And that looks like the end of our questions. And so with that, if we go to the next slide, this slide shows the links to our ESG webpage, the ESG guidelines, which will that serve as the basis for the 2024 NOFA, and the ESG program team contact. If you can't reach out to Rep directly, you want to send a general question, you can send it straight to the ESG NOFA inbox. And let's see, one more question. This has changed from last year. Amanda, looks like we have one more question come in.
Oh, this has changed from last year. 2.6% was last year. Now admin is 1%. Yes, that is true. It has changed.
Let's go to the next slide. And here are our social media contact pages. You can like us on Facebook, follow us on X, and also on LinkedIn. And then the final slide we always put up is we are always looking for good people here at HCD. If you want to join our team and help us with our mission here in California, please click on these links, and we'd love to hear from you. And that is going to conclude our office hours for today. Our next session will be 2 weeks from today on February 12th, and we will have a live demo, and we're going